Thank you very much for this exciting talk and informative. I think we now have, well, roughly a quarter of an hour for discussion. So if there are any questions, please raise your hand, or you can just type it in the chat.
Oh, I think Anna Maria is the first to say she has a question in the chat.
Okay, so Anna Maria, can you unmute and ask your question, please?
Well, first of all, thank you for this interesting presentation. You really wrapped all the, amazing things around these artificial models. And I agree with you that we need to be able to have an understanding of them and perhaps make comparison, and at the long term, maybe interact with them. From my perspective, it's an old question, it's about a production problem. So the production problem is to say, you produce words, sentences, and what are you going to do with these things? So one approach that has been pursued here with large language model is, in effect, to be able to have a mathematical calculus on probability of distribution of words. So it's able to predict the next word, right? So with transformer, you have layers, and you can imagine that syntactic structure is going to be there at some point, but there has to be a lot of work from syntacticians because, relational grammar is not really syntax. And the major problem, I think, is that, in the ancient times, it was said, I think Aristotle or Plato say that, language is a computational system, maybe not in these terms, but it's a system that relates sounds or whatever other stimulus, right, the sensory motor, to meaning. Now, we don't have this here. We have words and we have a distribution array to predict the next word. I think most of the work that linguists can contribute to this kind of system is to be able, and I know that there are papers out there like Structformer, for example, that introduces syntax at the layer in transformer, but relate meaning to sound.
Right.
So, yeah.
And that makes perfect sense. So, I mean, there's people also arguing that actually the main problem is not missing meaning, but the main problem is missing sound.
Yes. Well,
and so there's also a very exciting progress in sort of training audio language models. So
yeah.
But I think to address your main point, which is that these models are not do not present a mapping between meaning and form.
Yes.
I would actually I think I disagree that that's a useful characterization of what these models are doing. They are. It's actually one of the big surprises, like how much meaning they seem to have picked up. And so basically these models work with they indeed they convert words or parts of words into numerical vectors. So that's just a row of numbers, and these rows are very long, and so we typically have maybe 1,000 numbers to represent one word. So we have a 1,000-dimensional space. And one thing we're discovering is that we have discovered over the last years is that the language modeling objective, as simple as it is, apparently contains an awful lot of information about semantic distinctions that we previously thought required actually grounding in the real world, right? Yeah. We don't exactly know where this ends. But I think it's unhelpful to basically assume that because they are only trained on a next word prediction, they are in principle unable to learn meaning.
No.
Practice that they do they do really pretty well on this. So I think there's more.
I'm prompted ChatGPT, and humans they interpret what they read. So the question is, where does the meaning come from, right? And I won't continue the discussion because there's a handful, a lot of questions. And I thank you very much, yes, for your
let me just very briefly add to this that I think to do real linguistic research with these things, we also need access to the training data. But
yes.
there's now a generation. So I put on my second slide, I mentioned Bloom chat. So that's actually, for instance, the Bloom model is actually an example of a large language model where we have full access. It's totally open source. We can trace what the training set is, what the model is, what the weights are, and I think this new generation of open source models would really allow for true interesting linguistic research.
Thank you.
Great. There are some questions in the chat. I don't know if you can see them, Yele. I mean, it's one about language pedagogy, whether we think that these NLP models will change the way we talk about language pedagogy. For example, terms like prompt engineering and zero-shot generalization have parallels in education, but no teacher would speak in such terms. Should they start? I mean, if you could give a brief response so that we can go through a couple more.
Yeah, so maybe we can come back to this question in a moment because I didn't completely catch it, didn't completely understand it. Maybe the person can ask a question live. Is that, or would you prefer?
Yes, I want to.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, no, my main thing is, trying to bridge the gap between the way that we talk about language processing and, how would we go about, in teacher training and, going into the classroom, should we start using this terminology, in terms of explaining the language learning process? Or do you think that there's still something very separate?
Yeah, I don't have very strong opinions about what the most helpful terminology is. I mean, there's definitely maybe that's part of what the question is addressing. There's a lot of controversy about the use of sort of too human-like words, even words like the hallucination problem. People worry about that using such a word from psychology or medicine even is actually a problematic. I tend not to worry too much about this because I think that's how language works, right? So whenever we learn about new tools, we need new terminology and we'll just borrow words that we already know from another domain, and people learn to deal with it. So I'm not so worried about this, but I'm open to be convinced that I'm wrong if I am. Yes.
So there is another point. Do you think large language models potentially produce content that is influenced by cultural biases and political biases?
Oh, very much so. Yes. There have already been sort of scary, somewhat scary, but maybe important experiments to train large language models on data sets that are scraped from far right websites, and then you see these models sort of like unsurprisingly produce a lot of very distasteful outputs, very racist, very sexist comments that come out. So yes, these models do reflect the political stance of that you also see in the training set, not one-to-one, and so it's a mistake to sort of think about these large language models as just copying what's in the training data. So they're not literally parroting what's in the training data, but they're very much build up representations based on that training data, and we need better ways of monitoring that. Yes.
Okay, so I will skip the second half of this because it is related to whether they possess awareness of the cultural norms and whether we can somehow improve them in this respect. But I think you've answered part of this with your answer to the first part.
Yeah.
there is another question. In your view, do the linguistic generalizations these models are able to capture entail the emergence of abstract linguistic knowledge or very powerful probability distributions over linguistic tokens and patterns?
Yeah. Well, I would say that from my perspective, so I was brought up in a time in natural language processing where probabilistic grammars were the standard way of doing computational linguistics of natural language processing. And then one of the things we had to learn, or we discovered basically in that era, is that there's not such that it's not helpful to make a big distinction between powerful probability distributions and real linguistic structures, right? So there are two perspectives on the same phenomenon. So I think the question presupposes a distinction that I actually don't think is the helpful way of looking at it. So, but sure, if you want to it's fine to describe them as very powerful probability distributions. But one thing that I think is very interesting for us as linguists and cognitive scientists is that the way we try to the arguments that we have that we're very used to about why humans have abstract linguistic knowledge, abstract syntactic knowledge, are not that's not actually such a different situation. There we're also sort of inferring from the high dimensional activation patterns of brains. We're trying to summarize that in a little nice abstract syntactic structure. And I think that's a very useful exercise, but that's what we also can now do with these large language models.
I think we're almost out of time, but there are two other points that are raised. The last one is the term reinforcement learning recalls behaviorism. Are there any parallels?
Oh, well, there's a direct line, yeah. So it's sort of like the classic and operant conditioning from behaviorism in the 1910s and 1920s has sort of led to the theory of reinforcement learning that was picked up in the 1990s in machine learning, and there got very successful. And in the last 10 years, we've seen enormous breakthroughs in artificial intelligence based exactly on those equations. So the famous results on chess from DeepMind and in particular Go, of beating the world champion in Go with deep learning, they were all based on reinforcement learning that goes straight back to reinforcement to behaviorism. But of course, behaviorism on steroids, with that actually that is not as naive anymore as the behaviorism that Chomsky criticized so famously. So it's actually a form of behaviorism that is perfectly willing to postulate rich internal states.
Yeah, there is another point. If you could take a final point. How is it possible that by learning to guess the next word, a system is able to solve mathematical problems, obtain named entities, and other incredible capabilities?
Yes.
Any idea on why or how these capabilities are produced from just guessing the next word?
Yeah, so this is a wonderful question, and it does come up. I think the best comparison really is that with Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection, that in the end says that differential survival, the fitness, one quantity is behind all the diversity that we see in nature, right? So how is it possible that we have something as intricate and complicated like the human eye, or the beautiful patterns that we observe everywhere in biology, from just one optimization function, which is just the survival of the fittest? And similarly, we see here that next word prediction is indeed extremely simple, but because it's so cheap to compute, and that there's so much data that you can then throw at it, and you can just repeat it for billions and billions and billions of times, we see sort of like emergent capabilities coming out of this optimization process, including if your train set includes things with lots of numbers and reasoning problems, that it can actually do, that we find models that can actually do some basic mathematics. But one last warning, ChatGPT, it's very likely that the makers of ChatGPT also cheat a little bit and actually now and then help their neural language model with a couple of symbolic tricks to actually get the numbers right, because we do also know that the current open source large language models are actually not very good at mathematics. So, and we don't know what OpenAI is doing under the hood exactly.
And it's, I think I should just say to this point that it's a good job that our children learn languages much faster and with much less data than the models require.
Yeah, that's definitely a key open issue for the field, yes, to understand how and why.
Great. Well, thank you. Let's thank our speaker. I don't know if you can unmute and clap. You could do that. Thank you very much.
Sure, we can.
And yeah, and thank you all for staying for the talk. And I hope you will join us again for the next SLE online lecture. We will advertise it hopefully soon. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. It was a joy.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
All right.